Good, gorgeous afternoon, everyone. Resistance. Merriam-Webster defines it as 1, the act of fighting against something that is attacking you or refusing to accept something. Number 2, a situation in which people or organizations fight against something or refuse to accept or be changed by something. Number 3, a force that acts to stop the progress of something or make it slower. And number 4, an organization that secretly fights against an enemy that has taken control of its country. Those definitions aptly apply and always have applied to women of African descent. We know that in Africa, the second largest continent with 3,000 distinct cultures, in the era pre the slave trade, women occupied many positions, including that of warriors. Most of you now know, if not prior to, then after the release of the movie The Woman King, which was loosely based on the Amazon Women Regiment of the Kingdom of Dahomey, which existed from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Since hearing about or seeing the movie, you also know that they are the only all-female army in modern history, and should therefore be an inspiring example of the brilliance and bravery of Black women. So the history of continued resistance and fighting for freedom and justice survives the Middle Passage, emerges and flourishes in the Western Hemisphere in myriad ways. But I'm going to confine my presentation to Black women in the United States, who since 1619 have been fighting against our triple oppression, race, class, and gender. Back to the era of the transatlantic slave trade, Black African women resisted from the moments they were snatched or sold to European slavers. For instance, while shackled in the filthy, stinking holds of the hellish cargo ships, some of them starved themselves to death, or when brought to the deck for hose cleansing, if they had the chance, threw themselves overboard. We will never know the names of those fearless women. Regardless, we will always remember their brave acts of resistance. Then once on these shores, unshackled literally, for the most part, but still figuratively, our resistance continued. Toni Morrison, in her profoundly beautiful Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved, has her protagonist said, at the very moment she and her newborn are about to be recaptured after a harrowing escape from her enslaver, and in that terrifying moment when she realizes she's being dragged back into hell and will be viciously beaten for attempting to escape, she performs a terrifying act of ultimate defiance and resistance. She throws her newborn baby girl into a well, rather than have her become yet another person. Well, there were many Seths in our history. You probably know we actually know the name of one of them because Toni based her story based Seth on that case. The woman's name was Margaret Peggy Garner, who in January of 1856, at the moment the cabin she, her children, and husband are hiding in, is surrounded by her master and his posse, and she realizes their recapture is imminent. She slits the throat of her baby and then tries to kill her other children, but is seized before she can complete the merciful act. The resistance of enslaved Black women over the 250 years of legalized slavery took many other forms. Sometimes the mere act of just waking up and or getting up was an act of resistance. Other times resistance was remembering one's mother tongue, keeping alive the customs, beliefs, practices like retelling African stories and tales, like singing certain songs in their languages and dancing certain dances and or beating out certain rhythms. Other times it was trying to recreate their cultures, smells, tastes, medicinal healings and cures, or encouraging escapes, or escaping. Or at times it was teaching the children how to be, how to live, so they'd avoid punishment, or learning how to read and write, and then teach that, and or do that. At other times it was probably the resistance to easily killing the master's baby, as if wet nurse thrived and grew on that enslaved Black woman's breast milk, while her own infant went wanting. Bea Richards, in her deeply moving, powerful, and defiant poem, A Black Woman Speaks, a must-read, describes how that enslaved woman nurses her master's babies, all the while knowing they grow up into her own children's enemies. Amen. Dr. Vanessa Holden, in her recent book entitled Black Women and Resistance in Slave Rebellions, points out how some black women had the ability to move from one plantation to another, which allowed them to gather information that could be helpful to insurrectionists like Nat Turner. In it, she also challenges the common belief and thinking and teaching that black men rebelled while black women resisted. As narrow, and shows the ways black women's daily acts of evasion and survival were crucial to Turner's August of 1831's rebellion and many others. It made the book have a wide readership. Later, we have the well-known examples of Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman from the 19th into the early 20th century, Ida B. Wells, who was a pistol-packing journalist and anti-lynching activist, and Mary Church Terrell, also a journalist and activist, both in the early 20th century. From that early to the mid-20th century and beyond, we have blues singers like Bessie Smith, Big Mama Thornton, and of course Billie Holiday, who was hounded by the U.S. government for singing Strange Fruit. In the mid-20th century into the 21st, Zora Neale Hurston, folklorist, novelist, anthropologist, Eslanda Good Robeson, journalist, internationalist, peace activist, Shirley Graham Du Bois, writer and activist, Claudia Jones, communist, author, journalist, activist, my mother, Louise Patterson, communist, organizer, activist, Esther Jackson, founder of the leftist literary journal Freedom Ways, Lorraine Hansberry, communist writer and famous playwright, the world-famous actress and activist, World War II French partisan and spy Josephine Baker, the courageous mother of the viciously murdered teenager Emmett Till, Mamie Till Mobley. His mother demanded the photo of his tortured body be shown, published, which is widely acknowledged as triggering the upsurge in the 1950s-60s civil rights movement. The activist writers and performers Alice Childress and Bea Richards, the civil human rights activists of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Ruby Bridges, Ruby Sales, Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, both of whom refused to give up their bus seats in Alabama. Professors Thelma Glass, Joanne Robinson, all organizers of the Montgomery West boycott. Gloria Richardson, the fearless civil rights organizer in Maryland. Leah Chase, the famous chef of Dookie Chase, if any of you have been there, of New Orleans, who fed many a civil rights activist and gave money. Diane Nash and her sisters in SNCC. The activist performers, singers, and songwriters, Lena Horne, Odetta, Nina Simone, and Abby Lincoln. Then in the 21st century, we have the three women who in 2013 started Black Lives Matter: Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Oh, and let me not forget to mention my dear sisters in struggle, Angela Davis, Erica Huggins, Kathleen Cleaver, and of course, Viola Davis. All of whom intentionally and openly dedicated their lives to resistance and rebellion. All the names of the black women I just mentioned, most of you have heard before and hopefully know something about. But if you didn't, maybe you'll look them up later. Obviously, there were many more I didn't name that you may know and hopefully will run across. But let us not only not forget, but hold up all the unnamed and unheralded black women who built our black communities, who loved them into existence, who sustained and sustained the black church where rebellion and resistance were oftentimes planned, because without black women, there wouldn't be a black church, who taught our children in one-room classrooms and are still teaching our children today, who took in and cared and still care for our single mothers, our elderly, our infirmed, and our babies, who delivered those babies when no one else could or would, who secretly also performed abortions. Oh, and by the way, did you know that the maternal death rate at the turn of the 20th century was better than it is today? That in some neighborhoods of New York City, The black maternal mortality rate is 5 times, not 3 times, 5 times that of white women in New York City. In the 1960s and 70s, black women started welfare rights movements. Today we find black women in urban food gardens. One heads a very large one right here in Brooklyn. So March is Women's History Month. Well, at least we get 31 days. Instead of the 27 that we get, or 28 in February. Looking back on the road, we've come a great distance, and there is much to celebrate. And we must celebrate our victories, as they were hard won. But they also inspire us to struggle on. Looking forward, our freedom road continues far beyond the horizon. We know this country wouldn't be what it is today if black women hadn't been here. This country was built on the back, sweat, blood, and tears of black people. And let us not forget the genocide of the indigenous people. It was built on the mass raping of black women who in the painful aftermath had to continue to care for their vicious abusers' homes, women, and children. When my grandson and I moved to New York from California 28 years ago, we lived with friends on the Upper West Side until I could find our own place. Well, Monday through Friday, as I walked my grandson to school, we'd see black women pushing white babies in strollers. Then on the weekends, when I could take him to the playground, there'd be all these white couples with those very same white babies. My grandson was completely baffled by it all, and one day he asked me what was happening. So I told him how this scene was part of a continuum dating back to enslavement, how these black women he was seeing today were exploited, including how many of these white parents intentionally hired black nannies as they knew the nannies would discipline their children when they, the parents, didn't, couldn't, or wouldn't. And to make matters even worse, like in the past, many had to leave their own children behind, and many are paid next to nothing for doing it. I want to leave you with this. We must remember there are many, many ways and forms of resistance and rebellion, and that none are too small or insignificant. That we must intentionally build on our everyday acts of resistance and rebellion in an organized manner, united and together. That our culture is the culture of resistance. It always has been. And it, along with our struggle for freedom and justice, have inspired the rest of the world. We must know and be proud of our history of resistance and rebellion and teach it, especially to our children. That our struggle for freedom is a struggle to truly democratize this country. I want to thank Sisters Place and you all who are here today, especially my dear Bedford sister, Viola, not only for her important contribution to the struggle, but also for this opportunity to be with you today. Let me end on the words of our brilliant sister warrior and poet, Jane Cortez, from her poem, There It Is. And if we don't fight, if we don't resist, if we don't organize and unify and get the power to control our own lives, then we will wear the exaggerated look of submission, the bizarre look of suicide, the dehumanized look of fear, and the decomposed look of repression forever and ever and ever. And there it is. Whoa.